Hi Garrett, welcome. How's it going?
Hey, pretty good. Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for taking the time to chat.
Sure.
So, just as a brief introduction before we get into the interview, Garrett is a independent filmmaker and the author of Rebel Yell, a novel about rock and roll, as well as Nightblade, an epic fantasy series. And I also just found out that you host two podcasts: the Storytelling Podcast and the Film Geeks Podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the creative writing process with Scrivener, but let's start at the beginning. You have a background as a film writer and director, right?
Yeah, that's how I kind of got started. It was a weird journey from filmmaking to writing. I worked as a freelance filmmaker for a while. Wanted to get into writing and directing, but so I was writing scripts and so on, and had never really heard of Scrivener. And so it's very, very hard to get into the film industry, especially as a director. You can work on crews, but nobody wants you to direct a film unless you've already directed a film. It's that weird catch-22.
Yeah.
And so after trying that for a long time, one of my best friends, another author named Zach Bolger, who writes under the name ZC Bolger, he said, "Why don't you turn your scripts into books and self-publish them and gain an audience that way, and then that could lead to turning them back into movies down the line." And so then I began writing, and he turned me on to the self-publishing podcast, and that's where I first heard about Scrivener, and I got it and just started learning everything I could about the program.
Absolutely.
It's because it's incredibly powerful.
I think that's where I first heard about it too, a couple years ago.
hmm
So, did you use a different piece of software to write scripts for films?
Yeah, there's a free piece of software out there called Celtics, which has an advantage in that you can write scripts, but it's also designed for the production end. So when you write a script, it's broken into your scenes, and you have named characters and everything. And when you write the script in there, it automatically catalogs all of your characters and catalogs your scenes, so that then when you go into production planning and you're like, we're going to shoot on these locations on these days,
Hmm.
all of that stuff is very easy to organize, and you can set up your casting, your shooting, everything. It's actually pretty amazing for filmmakers.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So now when you write film scripts, you don't use Scrivener, right? You use Scrivener just for novels?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's I still actually do you I when I do a film project now, I will generally have my Celtics project in which the script writing happens, but I actually do still use a Scrivener file because I use my research folder with links, to
Yeah.
websites and everything like that, because that's a functionality that Celtics doesn't have. In fact, I've never really seen a word processor except for Scrivener that does that.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So how long have you been writing professionally? Like at what point did you transition from the film writing over to writing novels?
Well, I published my first novel in December of 2012.
Okay.
Yes. So I was still working a 9 to 5 job at that point, but I published my first actual novel in early January. Like I wrote a trilogy of novellas
Hmm.
starting in December, published it as a complete single novel in January of 2013, and then I published another book in March, and then another one in May. And at that point, I was actually let go from my 9 to 5 job, and of course, I was kind of panicking and freaking out. And my wife said, "Yeah, but you're making money writing now. Why don't you just do that?" Because my wife is incredible and amazing. So that was when I became a full-time author, and since then I've been a writer for a living, which is pretty great.
That's nice. I mean, it sounds like you were just thrown into the fire.
Exactly, exactly.
I guess it worked out for you though.
Yeah, for sure.
So, did you write your first novel in Scrivener, the first three, the series of novellas?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I
Okay.
listened to the podcast for a while, and then got myself a copy of Scrivener. So by the time I was ready to take my first script and turn it into a book, it was just Scrivener from the get-go.
That's amazing. So these were scripts that you had already written. You just
Yeah,
novelized them.
yeah,
Wow, that's pretty cool. So like the story was already there. It was just you had to add more words, right?
exactly.
Less
Yeah,
dialogue, more words.
yeah.
That's really cool.
Description and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So can you describe for me the experience of discovering Scrivener for the first time? I mean, as somebody who uses, script writing software, it probably wasn't that far-fetched, whereas some people who come from Microsoft Word or just from plain text files like RTF files, seeing Scrivener can be kind of overwhelming. What was it like for you?
Yeah, well, it was, and I sometimes forget that. I sometimes forget how it was when I first got the program and opened it up, because just initially, I got over it pretty quickly, but just initially you open it up and it looks very complex.
Hmm.
And I often forget how that was, because I'll tell people, somebody's like, "What do you write in?" And I'm like, "Scrivener," and they get it, and they'll message me or write me and be like, "What is this thing? I don't understand." And now I'm just like, "What are you talking about? It's so simple." But there
Uh-huh.
there is that initial thing where you have to learn what the binder is, how the different folders work, how
Hmm.
formatting, and like compiling to me is second nature now.
Hmm.
And anybody I know who tries to compile a book for the first time, myself included, the first time many years ago, is just, what is this? It can be a little bit overwhelming, but it is one of those things that once you get the hang of it, it's so simple once you figure it out.
Yeah, I felt the same way about the compile screen first. There's a lot of options there.
Yeah.
So how did you get over that? Did you just are you the kind of person that finds a new piece of software and just plays around with it until they get it? Or are you the kind of person that goes and like watches tutorials and reads the help manual and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I sort of do a mix of both. I decide, okay, I want to do this, and I basically throw myself into it, and my first result is usually not what I want at all. So then I figure out what is wrong, like not what I did wrong, because I don't know what I did wrong, but what didn't achieve the result I wanted. And then I go and I Google how to do this specific thing. And then I
Hmm.
go back, I do it, and that thing is correct. And maybe now something else needs to adjust. So I've always been pretty good at learning software. I learned video editing software, self taught, audio mixing software, self taught. So it took me a few tries, probably a few weeks of really, getting it down and learning all of the different things. And I'm still learning. There's still things that I am just getting, into, where my goals for each book that I format and design and write always expand, because now I know how to do. I always know how to do a book the way I did it last time. So I'm always looking for, what can I do newly this time? What's going to make it better, faster, more organized?
Can you give us some examples of some of the ways that you've improved?
Yeah, sure. So my first book was very simple. It was a sort of bit of a psychological thriller, and it was formatted. I formatted it all in Scrivener and published it all online, and it was very simplistic. I just I there's no fancy titles on the chapters or anything like that. It had a very simple table of contents. By the time I got to one of my other series, in addition to the Nightblade series that I'm writing now, I have two books published in the Realm Keepers series, and that series I really went all out. And actually, in terms of formatting, that's probably like the best example of my work, and just in how the book looks. I had six different characters in that book series, and they all have different elemental powers as wizards. So at the top of each chapter, I figured out how to insert in the ebook a symbol for their elemental power. And those symbols are also represented on the cover of the book, and they're very central to the plot. So I didn't have to label each chapter with the character's name, because just putting the
Ah,
element name, the reader goes, "Oh, it's from this person's perspective," and
that's
they're right
great.
into it.
Yeah.
And I figured out how to get actual font choices into, like, so that my chapter headings were in a certain font that I wanted, rather than just the default font that whatever somebody opens something up on their Kindle and so on. You just have a default font, whatever that person sets. Well, I figured out how to make a chapter heading look exactly how I wanted to, which made it feel more like an actual, book that you'd get professionally, that kind of thing.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think the series of articles that you wrote on your website about formatting for Scrivener was about this subject, right? So
Correct.
if anybody wants to learn about it, they could go to garrettrobinson.com and Check that out.
Yeah,
Garrett B.
GarrettBRobinson.com.
Robinson, yeah.
Somebody else has Garrett Robinson. I'll get it. I'll get it one of these days.
Yeah, just keep at it.
Yeah,
Eventually he'll let it lapse, and then you can just jump on it.
that's right.
Well, that's really cool. So before we get into more about the compiling and the post-production process, and I think that's very interesting, but I want to hear a little bit more about your writing process now with Scrivener. As somebody who has written scripts and been a writer for a long time, do you think that switching to Scrivener changed your productivity as a writer?
Oh, very. It tremendously, because whenever you sit down to write, at least if you're like me, I mean, if you are what's like a pantser, you write by the seat of your pants, you don't outline first and anything. I guess to some degree one word processor is much like the other, but if you do any amount of preparation, then you have notes. You write down things about your characters. You keep track of details so that the details are consistent throughout your book, and you don't have huge jumps in what do you call it, continuity, where a character's eyes are blue in one chapter and then in the next chapter they're green. Like you write these things down so that you don't mess that up. And just Scrivener is the best for that. If you do work in something like Word, you're going to have to keep those notes anyway, but you're just going to have to keep them in a separate document or write them down in a notepad, and you're going to be flipping through pages. It's just super irritating. So the way I go about it now is based on the process that Sean Platt and Johnny B. Truant use from the Self-Publishing Podcast. And they've actually published a course on, what do you call it, udemy.com, outlining how they do it. And I mean, they are friends of mine, full disclosure, but it's a great course. People should check it out. And how it starts is a very, very simple concept for the book, just what's called a log line, like in one or two sentences, what is the book? And then I expand that out into a paragraph and then multiple paragraphs. And then I, break it down by what's happening in each chapter. And so it's all happening in the research folder. It's all happening in, outlining and what I call story beats. And then basically it's just taking the simple core concept that is at the center of the book and expanding it and expanding it and expanding it until I have an outline that is detailed enough that I can then sit down and write the first draft. And then I take all of those beats, I put them in the binder, and I start actually writing the first draft of the book.
So at what kind of granularity are you aiming for when you plan a book? Or do you want it to be planned down to the scene, obviously, or do you plan it down to different parts within the scene?
I plan it really, really detailed. I'll also include lots of notes in my scene. When I'm writing the outline for what happens in a scene. One thing that I always consider is there are things that happen in every scene that relate to other parts of the book, and I will include those notes in my scene descriptions. It's like, in this scene, character A needs to have a lot of conflict with character C because near the end of the book, those two are going to have a reconciliation. So I don't necessarily know what that conflict is going to be, but I know that the two of them need to have some disagreement, just as like a really broad general example. Yeah. The thing about that is that it makes your outlining process take a little bit longer.
Sure.
And when you write the first draft, when I get in there and I'm actually writing the first draft, things always change. Always, always, always. You can't help it. So I might write a lot of details, especially near the end of the book. I might go into all this detail, and then the last third of the book ends up being completely different from what I wrote. So that's a little bit of extra work, but with that plan laid down at the beginning, that is what allows me to write a first draft so fast. Like I do write my books very, very quickly, and I wouldn't be able to do it if I wasn't so detailed in my outlining.
So how long do you spend outlining versus the drafting process?
Outlining is usually the process of it depends on the book, because I've published books that are 40,000 words long and I've published books that are 250,000 words long. But it's probably about a third of my time is spent outlining versus a third of my time spent writing the first draft, and then the final third is editing and post production.
Okay, that seems pretty good. I mean, pretty efficient, right?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people will write an outline that's a lot more general, and if that's the case, I think it can take only like up to a tenth of your time.
Sure.
But I do think that it makes your first draft, and especially your editing, is going to take longer, because without that level of detail and really getting to know your characters before you start, you can make mistakes, and I still do that, even getting as detailed as I do.
Right, because then you're finding the story within the drafting process as opposed
Yeah,
to finding the story in the planning process and then executing in the drafting process.
exactly.
So how long does it take you from start to finish for a normal, like, let's say a 60,000 word novel, which 60,000 words, for those who don't know, would be the minimum for like a full-length novel?
Right. Nightblade is 80,000, so it's pretty comparable. And Nightblade was actually, all told, Nightblade was shoot. It was about, I think, 50 hours of work, but I spaced that out over the course of like four weeks or something like that.
Wow.
So that was, yeah. I mean, like I said, I do get this done pretty quick, and I don't. For me, it's not like, certain people don't like to talk about how much they produce. John and Johnny from the self-publishing podcast always, they've adopted this policy of like, we don't want to talk about how fast we write, how much we produce, because it invites comparison.
Right.
I agree and disagree. I don't. I know that people can get discouraged from seeing that people are really fast at what they do. I just don't think people should be discouraged. I think they should be like, oh, that's awesome, and that's my benchmark. And you can also just gauge like your own production. Like, I don't produce as fast as Sean and Johnny do, so you can gauge your own production on like, okay, so they produce at that speed and they're able to put out a new book every single month. Well, I produce slightly slower, so I can produce a new book every 6 weeks, and it's good to know, that about yourself.
Absolutely.
I think. Yeah.
Do you think the experience like creating stories for script writing carried over?
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. One of my favorite books on storytelling in general is Save the Cat,
Yeah.
and I read that book a lot when I was putting my scripts together, and I would always use it and go back through it and through it and through it, and so much of that same skill and that same, you have to be concise, and you have to keep interest, and you have to keep your pace going and everything. So much of that translates over into writing books. So that was, I think, really valuable experience for me.
And to tie this back into that Udemy course that you mentioned about using beats for in Scrivener to write a story, I've watched the course, and it's very informative, and I found it very useful, especially for how you can use Scrivener for these classic story structuring methods.
Right.
And it's interesting to me because the Beats video, Beats is like a script writing term, right?
Right.
But what they're doing there, starting at one sentence and expanding it out and then expanding that out, some people call that the snowflake method. And so
Yeah.
what they're doing is not a new method,
Right.
and it's not even very groundbreaking in terms of like storytelling, but the fact that they do it in Scrivener and show you puts it into perspective. You're like, okay, so I read this book on the snowflake method, but here it is enacted in front of me.
Yeah, there's in any field of study and in any technique, whether it's art or science or whatever, there is your basic theory of how a thing works or how it should work, and then there are, how do you use the tools to enact the theory? And Scrivener is simply a really amazing tool. But in order to get a good book, it's not enough to have a great tool. You need the basic theory. You need to know how to actually go about it. You can have the best hammers and nails and saws in the world, but if you're not a good carpenter, you still can't build a good house,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get it down into the specifics of Scrivener. When you're planning, when you're doing your beats, do you use the corkboard? Do you use the just the file tree in the left?
File. I'm a file tree guy. I used to use the corkboard, and because I don't know if you can see it back there, but I have a corkboard in my background with a lot of. I really love the physical, being able to move cards around and everything like that. It just helps me visualize things a lot more.
Totally.
But by the time I get to my computer and I'm working on my stories, I'm pretty much ready to just do it in a linear fashion. So I
Hmm.
started off using the corkboard a lot more, and then I was just like, I don't really need that because I've usually done all of that work
Hmm.
in the physical universe on my actual physical corkboard, you
Hmm.
know?
I just discovered recently that you could use the corkboard in Scrivener and then print out note cards
Yeah.
and like cut them out. So of course, if we end up releasing this as audio, the users won't be able to see, but I'm sure you can see now.
Oh
There's the
yeah.
corkboard too, and they're color coded, right? So I took
Yeah.
those. So for those who can't see the video, I have two point of view characters in this novel. One is colored green and one is colored blue, and I put those in Scrivener, printed them out, and arranged them into a four-part story. So yeah, absolutely, I totally get that. You know, you want the physical manifestation of your ideas because it makes it more real.
Exactly.
And it
Exactly.
helps you fill in the gaps, right? Like if you put it on a cork board and you're like, oh, the second part or second half of part three is totally empty, you
Right.
know that the story's not ready yet.
Yeah, exactly. And when you start planning that stuff out, you know, you do it with your corkboard, and I do it with my binder and the thing. Color coding is just one tiny little thing that is so great because by the time I've written what I think is going to be my outline, I'm like, cool. Well, in the last half of this book, we never hear from this character
Right.
until the last chapter when they pop in and the audience and the reader is expected to care about them. No, like we need to tell more, and it just really helps you identify and physically see what's going on and who it's happening to.
Hmm. Are there any other structural theories or methods that you use? You mentioned Save the Cat, which is
Yeah.
a great book.
Yeah.
One of my favorites is Story Engineering.
I haven't read that one. I'll check it out.
I would definitely recommend that one. It's very informative, and I use that to kind of plan this book I'm writing. But are there any other structural methods that you use?
The Blake Snyder beat sheet is essentially my storytelling Bible, and then other than that, I have spent a lot of time studying and really trying to understand the three act structure because I feel like the three act structure is a simple concept to explain and sort of get, but it's very difficult to get into the nitty gritty of like what it actually means. And of
Hmm.
course, where most people fall down is the second act. Everybody knows how their story is going to start, and most people know how their story is going to end. And it's everything else in the middle that people just go, you know, appetite over tin cup. And that is something that I am very adamant about. Is like the middle of the book needs to be every single bit as good as the beginning and the end, and it can't just like obviously the middle of your book are is the steps that are necessary to get from the beginning to the end, but it has to be more than that. There has to be value in the middle of your book, in the second act itself. It can't just be it can be if you're writing like very plot driven type thriller, but it's way more interesting to me if there are things that happen in the middle of the book that don't necessarily relate to the beginning and the end, that are their own
Right.
little. And for me, Lord of the Rings is one of the best examples of that. Lord of the Rings is my favorite book, and they do these things that don't really relate. You know, Moria. You know, when they go down into the mines of Moria and Gandalf fights the Balrog, that doesn't directly relate to the confrontation with Sauron. It's
Right.
just a thing that happens, and it's its own little vignette of a story with the characters. You know,
Yeah.
and if if it was strictly like a plot driven novel, there would have been absolutely no delay between them leaving Rivendell and arriving in the forest of the elves and meeting Galadriel and her giving them the gifts and everything.
Hmm.
But Moria is something that was put in as its own little mini story within the story. So
Right.
Yeah,
That's really interesting. I think you'll really like story engineering.
awesome.
The reason that I find it fascinating is because he sets out milestones, especially through Act Two, which he calls Part Two and Three of a four-part story.
Hmm.
And he has like specific milestones that kind of break out Act Two and make it less of a drag. Because
Yeah,
like that's like the big middle part of the story that people struggle with.
right.
They call it the beginning, the muddle, and the end, right? Because nobody really knows what's going on in the middle. But he defines it, Act Two is separated into two parts by a midpoint, and then each of Part Two and Part Three should have like what he calls a pinch point in the middle of each of those acts. And of course, we can't get into that whole book right now, but I think you'll find it very interesting because it definitely goes into this three-act structure
Right.
and kind of defines it more and gives each part a different context. So it's very helpful.
That's great. Well, I'm definitely going to check it out.
Cool. So let's talk about the writing process.
Hmm.
You mentioned briefly that you color code and use like point of view labels.
Hmm.
How else do you use Scrivener to help you do the actual writing, the actual drafting? So some examples would be like the word count goals, split screen, full screen. Sometimes people use custom labels or status labels. Like, what's your process for drafting?
Yeah. So by the time I've got my outline done and I'm ready to start writing, I go all out. I work in hour-long chunks. I have a timer on my computer, and what do you call it? I unplug the internet.
Mm-hmm.
I literally shove my phone into my couch in my office. Like, I don't put it there. I put it between the cushions on vibrate so that I can't hear it. I put on my headphones. I start playing Rise Against. They're the only thing I listen to when I write. I don't really know why, except I can write to them, and they're great. I love their music. So then for an hour, I am just writing, and I'll generally write between 2,500 and 3,500 words an hour. And I keep track of my hours. I always staticize everything that I'm doing. So I write as much as I can for that hour, and I have my word counter sitting there, and I always have it set for a goal for this hour of 2,500 words. But honestly, that's my minimum. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I usually do, more than that. And by the time the hour's done and the timer, like the timer's sitting in the corner of the screen, so I'm like watching it while it's going, and I'm always full screened. My second computer monitor over here is shut down so that there's literally no distractions. It's just me and the draft. So by the time the clock starts getting into the last 15 and the last 5 minutes and everything, I'm really like, pounding away at the keyboard. And I'm definitely a big believer in like the faster I write, the better I write.
Mm-hmm.
I might have more technical errors, but I feel like the voice is a lot cleaner because I'm not thinking too hard about every single thing that I'm saying. That's for editing.
Mm-hmm.
First draft should just be raw, and then you refine it. So then I write. When the hour's done, I plug my internet back in, see if I got any texts, any emails, and everything like that. And I'll generally take a between 15 and 30 minute break, and then I'm just right back in for another hour. And I keep track of my word counts, like I said, and I also post them. If anybody follows me on Instagram, I don't really know why you would. Some people do. I always take a photo of the little Scrivener screen counter
Mm-hmm.
with my phone, just because it looks more Instagrammy that way rather than screen capturing it. So I take a photo of the screen capture and then I post it to Instagram, which automatically posts it to my Facebook, my Twitter, and my Tumblr. And that's actually like a way that I keep myself accountable to my audience, because
Mm-hmm.
they'll see, hey, I am actually working on the next book. You don't need to send me any more emails asking me for the next book.
I'm working, I promise.
I swear. And it's such a little thing. It sounds like such a little thing, just having a word counter sitting there that you can actually share with other people.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a little thing to me. Like, it's very important, and it's part of my interactivity with my fans. Of course, my Instagram feed looks ridiculous. It's just a whole bunch of pictures of word counters, but that and the ability to write a chapter and then move on to the next chapter, as opposed to something like Word where you start a new page, or you could start a new Word document for the next chapter, but that's ridiculous. Like, just, I'm done with this file, start a new one, and being able to flip back and forth is it just makes writing a dream. It's really amazing.
Do you record the word counts anywhere else, like in a spreadsheet or something like
Yeah, I
that?
have a spreadsheet that tracks it tracks my daily totals, and then it also tracks this hour I did this many, this hour I did this many,
Mm.
and I don't really. For me, the statistic is the most important thing. So I don't track data on like like did I check my Twitter during this hour? Because if I check my Twitter during this hour, then the hour ends at that point. Like
Yeah,
I don't. So I keep track of my totals. I'm always trying to push my level of production up. You can only really get so high at a certain point.
sure.
You can't really easily push it beyond a certain level. But yeah, I keep track of my daily production, my weekly production, and pretty much everything else I do. I'm a little, you know, detail oriented when it comes to that.
I think that's good though, because how else are you going to find when you're most productive and what the most productive system is for you if you never track it?
Exactly.
Is that how you discovered that the 1 hour blocks are your sweet spot?
Yeah, I tried 90 minutes for a while, and it's weird. Sometimes I will change back to 90 minutes because I feel like a change can increase my productivity.
Mm,
But when I change to 90 minutes, I'm usually really productive for the first few times I do it, and then that productivity starts to decline.
interesting.
And then I switch back to an hour, and I get much more productive. And then it sort of settles, and it takes a long, long time for hour-long blocks to become less productive. Eventually, they do, and I switch back and forth. So 90% of the time I'm writing in hour-long chunks, and then every once in a while to just switch it up, I switch to 90. But also I'm not my most productive first thing in the morning. That's why I always make my YouTube video first thing in the morning. I wake up, I make a video for YouTube, and then I start writing. Because if I sit down, first thing in the day and start trying to write,
Hmm.
I'll write 1,500 words in an hour. Like I'm just not there yet. I need time to
Hmm.
get my gears going. And I can write late at night, no problem. Some of my most productive hours are actually between 1 and 4 a.m.
Wow.
I just can't do that because I have a wife and children.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is fascinating that everybody's productive at a different time of the day. I've heard other people say that they're not productive in 1 hour chunks. They need like 6 hours of uninterrupted time in order to
Right.
actually produce anything. But everybody's a little different, and the way you discover what your most productive time is by recording the data.
Exactly. And good luck tracking any of that data if you're writing in Word. Like, oh my
Yeah,
God.
that's funny. Do you ever go back and self-edit while you're typing, or is it like a no? You can't look back rule. Like, I will not read what I just wrote in the last hour chunk because then I'll start self-editing.
Yeah, sometimes I'll go back because I will have written something or mentioned some detail that I need to refer to in what I'm writing now. But in general, it's like and every time I do that, when I go back to look for a detail, I'm reading through things and I'm looking for the detail I'm looking for, and I always spot shit. I'm like, oh,
Mm,
there kind of
yeah.
thing. Da, 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 da. But I'm able to disengage and not self edit other than it's not self-editing. It's like I do have a thing of like I'm not going to edit it until I'm done with the first draft.
Hmm.
And minor little notes and typos and stuff doesn't really count in my mind, if that makes sense.
Right. Totally. Like, oh, I see that. Might as well fix it since I'm in here.
Exactly. But it doesn't drag me in. Like some people talk about when they start looking at what they've already written, they get dragged in and they can't stop themselves from reading and continuing to, go through and try and make everything perfect. And it's like you're not going to make everything perfect. Sorry.
Hmm. And you're losing all the productivity that you could have had writing the next chapter instead of
Exactly.
rewriting what you just wrote.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you've written the draft. Walk us through your self-editing process. And I say self-editing because I find that most people do one self-edit before they send it to an outside editor. Do you do that?
Well, I'm going to do a do as I say, not as I do thing here, which Johnny B. Truant did for a long time. Johnny B. Truant now uses an outside editor
Hmm.
um, because he has a really good one and he can afford it. I self-edit. I do not hire an outside editor,
Oh,
and
fascinating.
I I I I run into the same problem he ran into when that was the case for him. it sounds really douchey to say that, like, I think I can do it, but most people can't.
Mm-hmm.
But I know from my own work and from reviews I've gotten and from, what other people have said, not just like my own ego,
Mm-hmm.
that my self-editing doesn't hold back my writing. I
Right.
know that it would be even better to hire an external editor, and I have two people that are my developmental editor and my copy editor that I can't wait to be able to hire these people, but they charge good rates because they are very damn good at what they do,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't afford them, right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I self-edit, uh, and it's not something that people should generally do. If you can, it saves you some money, but it will always be better to get an external viewpoint, somebody else looking through your word and your story and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So
I mean, maybe after a decade of storytelling experience, at least you know what your blind spots are.
exactly. Yeah, and I'm always trying to look for new things. I'm part of a Facebook group called Writers World, and I'll post samples of my work in there all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And they're always like, you're doing this too much. You do this. I've noticed that you use this phrase like repeatedly, and it's a fairly innocent phrase, that it's not something that I could necessarily spot myself.
Right.
Even just like something as simple as "and then he," beginning a sentence with "and then he."
Mm-hmm.
I submitted one thing that was 2,000 words long, and they were like, "You use 'and then he' 3 times in this 2,000 words," and it's just odd enough that it sticks my attention.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, I changed 2 of them.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You have to constantly be looking for what you do over and over again, and you need to constantly be trying to knock those habits out, if you want to be a self-editor. But like, I'm very, very lucky in that my command of spelling and grammar, and specifically like punctuation, there's so many people who just can't really get what a comma splice is.
Mm-hmm.
They don't understand, and that's fine. If you're a writer, like, honestly, the exactitude of spelling and grammar is the job of the editor. So you don't need to be perfect at all of that stuff unless you are also the editor. But if you're not perfect at that stuff, don't be your own editor. Like,
Right.
it's really, because then you immediately, to any reader or any reviewer, you come off as, self-publishing schlock, quote unquote.
Right.
And we don't need more of that.
That's
in the
true.
world.
I mean, it sounds like you're using like a critique group as well, so I would count that as outside editing, even if it's not for the whole thing. It's like, here's an
Exactly.
important scene. Why don't you guys make sure I'm not screwing anything up?
Exactly.
So do you edit straight in Scrivener? Do you use the comments? Do you print it out on paper and read it that way?
I do pretty much everything in Scrivener. First, I just do a read through. I export an ebook immediately, and I read the whole thing on my Kindle.
Oh, okay.
And that's not because I'm not even close to typos and punctuation and all that sort of thing. That is for essentially developmental editing.
Mm-hmm.
Are there major flaws in my story? Does this chapter relate to the other ones appropriately? Are things too long? Are things too short? And so I'll make just general notes on my Kindle thing, because on my Kindle app you can tap and insert a note, and I'll read through the whole book that way, and then I'll flip through my notes, and I'll go back in and make big edit changes. Like a chapter gets cut in half, or a scene gets removed, or a new scene is added.
Right.
So I'll do that. If I feel the need to, I rarely feel the need to. I've only felt the need to do this once. I might do that a second time. Generally, once is enough. And then I start going through and I do line/copy editing,
Mm-hmm.
where often my phrasing is not ideal on the first draft. I can tighten a lot of my sentences up. Other sentences can be combined. Other sentences are entirely unnecessary, and it's getting into like the paragraph level of editing.
Mm-hmm.
And if I do see typos and punctuation, whatever, I'll fix them. But that's not the point. The point is to get my phrasing the way that I want it to be, and my language to communicate what I want it to communicate. And then once that's done, then I go through it in Scrivener again, watching for, misspellings, wrong character's name, et cetera, et cetera. And then I actually also record my own audiobooks. So I narrate my audiobooks and so on. So audiobook is actually my final copy editing phase, because reading a book out loud is the best way in the world to catch errors that you don't catch.
That's great. I love that you said that. Do you ever use the text-to-speech functionality in Scrivener? Like just to hear it?
I don't actually. And I know that that's a thing that a lot of people use, but something about it doesn't totally work for me, because I feel like, this is going to sound really dumb, I feel like I'm concentrating on the delivery, and I'm like, this delivery sucks. And of course it sucks. It's text to speech, but I do come from a directing background, and I was an actor when I was a kid, and I'm actually a professionally trained voice talent.
Right.
So I can't disengage my mind from being like, you're not reading this book well at all.
But see, and I feel the same way. If I had to read my own books out loud, I'd be like, oh God, I hate the sound of my voice. And I would be so distracted by that, I couldn't listen. But for me,
Right.
like hearing that robot voice, I'm like, okay, it's removed my personality from it, and I can just
Right.
listen to the words.
Yeah.
But either way, whether you're reading it yourself out loud or you're gritting through the robot text-to-speech voice, I think it's good to hear it out loud, and that allows you to do the final, proofreading, copy edit phase.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's interesting to me, too, that your process mirrors what a professional edit would be, right? Like
Right.
first draft, then the structural edit, redraft, then a line edit, and then the out loud proofread. Like that's what you would go through with a professional editor as well, right?
Right. Absolutely.
So the process is still there. It's just that you happen to be doing it yourself.
Exactly. Which again, it's like, if people are really self-aware of themselves and they are good enough to do it, then, I'm not going to tell you not to. I still think anybody, from Johnny to me to anybody else out there, is always better with an external editor. If you're self-aware and you know that your skill level won't hold you back, go for it, because it's also it's a really valuable learning experience for when you are working with an editor. At some point, it's really valuable to know what they look for, what they're going through, how their process works. So I think everybody should edit themselves as best they can before they send it to an editor, because that's another thing. I do some freelance book editing and for other people, and I'll say the majority of the time, people send me what I'm pretty sure is their first draft. And if it's not their first draft, because it's like, it's just got errors. I mean, typos and grammar and so on aside, it's wow. It's really, and I'm just like, dude, you are literally paying me to do something that you could easily do yourself. Like if you send a book to an editor that's 50%, they're probably going to return it to you at 85%. If you send an editor a book that's 85%, they'll return it to you at 95 to 100%.
Right.
100% is basically impossible, but you get it. Like the better the quality that you put into the editing machine, the better the quality that's going to come back.
And if you're paying for it, why waste your money? You got to send them the best thing that you can produce.
Certain people, I just and certain people, because I offer developmental editing and copy editing separately. Copy editing is by the word. Developmental editing is by the hour. Is what I charge. And certain people are like, I want to hire you as a copy editor. So I go through, and of course I am reading the story. I have to be. And sometimes after the first chapter, I'll write the person. I'll be like, not to be whatever, but I think that you should hire a developmental editor. I offer that service, but if you're not, I'm not trying to just upsell you. I can recommend many other great developmental editors. And some people just get stuck, and they're stuck in their own minds that no, I just want to clean up the copy and keep the story exactly the way that I want to. And fair play to them. I mean, who am I to say? But some people do need it.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
So after you've edited You're going to compile the book for ebook formatting. We've talked a little bit about custom images and custom fonts and ebook formatting. What's your process for exporting for publication?
Okay, so I export in three formats. I export Kindle, EPUB, and then in to Word for print. And that is the one thing that I would love. That's my number one, like, most wanted feature is I want Scrivener to be able to export directly to InDesign, because InDesign is how you design a print book, right?
Wouldn't that be nice?
Oh my God, it'd be amazing. And exporting to Word and then importing Word into your InDesign document is not that difficult. It's just one extra step. But oh man, if we could only put it directly into InDesign. So I'll go for the Kindle file first. And generally, I have a number of templates for books that I've already done. I have a template for Touch. I have a template for Non-Zombie, Hit Girls, Mid-Realm, et cetera, et cetera. So I look at my other books and I'm like, what do I want this to be most like? And I use that template and then I modify it from there. And when I started, I actually was a big believer in the as is feature. I just want all of my chapters and all of my files to go out as is, and I'll do all the formatting in the files themselves. That works for really simple formatting, but boy, you are not tapping into Scrivener if you do it that way. So now I've gotten to the point where everything is taken care of in the compile window, and everything is formatted according to metadata tags, and I do all of my padding that way and everything, because then if you decide that you want a little bit more padding on the pages of each new chapter, like if you want it to start 6 lines down, every chapter has 6 blank lines before it says chapter 1. So you export that and you look at it and you're like, it's not quite enough space. If you're doing everything as is, then you have to go into every goddamn chapter and you have to, sorry, I don't know actually if I can swear. Is that okay?
It's totally fine.
Okay. So then you have to go into every chapter and you have to add 2 lines. Or you can go into your compile window and you can just add 2 more lines at the beginning of each chapter with 2 clicks.
Oh, I see.
So
you have the metadata doing all of the padding and the formatting, as opposed to like going into that file and pressing enter a couple times to move it down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that is, once you really get a handle on how all of that stuff works, that's huge. It's like, it's to some degree, it helps to know like computer programming, because it works almost the exact same way as like designing a website.
Right.
It's like all files of this type will be formatted this way. All files of this type will be formatted this other way.
And isn't that the power of Scrivener? It's supposed to be formatting agnostic, right? So whatever you format in your editor, like if you want a bright pink screen to write, that's fine. When you export it, it totally strips it and turns it into an ebook.
Exactly.
That's what makes it powerful.
Yeah. And the different functionalities, just a lot of people don't even realize this, but you can set different formats for different levels of documents. Right. So a perfect example of that is I also format all of the print books for Johnny and Sean from the Self Publishing Podcast. So their most recent book is a book called Invasion. It's about an alien invasion. And it's told in a series of days. Day 1 of the invasion, day 6, day 10.
Right.
So the way that I structured that is that there are all these chapters that take place on day 1. So I have a folder called day 1, and all of the day 1 chapters are in that folder. Well, you can set formatting for the folder itself so that you start with a title page that just says really big in a special font in the center of the page, day 1. And then you turn the page and chapter 1 starts and it just looks completely different. Like that's a small thing, but if you don't know how to use the multiple formatting levels in Scrivener, right, you really couldn't achieve that effect.
And it's hard to do this, especially if we're doing this as an audio interview or even as a video interview, because we can't see the interface. But what you're saying is you're taking the scenes that you write and you're putting them into a chapter folder.
Exactly. Well, it's actually chapters that they wrote into I guess you could call it a section folder.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And so did you have different formatting for day 1 as opposed to like day 10? Did the the formatting changed as the book progressed, or are you just saying that
No,
you're just formatting?
that's stayed consistent. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So you're just formatting the section title.
Exactly. So that sections look different from chapters, and also the back matter looks different from the chapters. For the chapters have, I think they had 8 lines of padding at the top of the page for each new
Right.
chapter. The back matter, that was too much, so I changed it to 4, and that's just because there are a different type of document, a different level of document.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So are there any other pro tips you have for compiling ebooks with Scrivener?
God,
Anything we haven't covered?
there's a billion of them. I
Yeah.
mean, one of the most powerful things in Scrivener is metadata. And metadata, like a lot of people just gloss over as soon as you say the word metadata. They have no idea because they have no idea what it means.
Right.
And all it really means is extra data and tags that are applied to any file. And a really good way to understand it is pretty much everybody knows iTunes and has an iTunes library. Well, if you took one of the songs in your iTunes library and you found that file on your computer, it would be the title of the song. You know, if the song is Miss American Pie, if you found the file on your computer, it would just be missamericanpie.mp3.
Right.
But all of those files have metadata, which is something that is written into the file that lists the artist, the album it's from, the length, the genre, everything. And that metadata is why when you open that file up in iTunes, it lists all of those things. It's not that iTunes recognizes the song and is like, oh, this is from that album or da da da. No, it's all written into the file itself.
Right.
So Scrivener metadata works the same way. So if you have a chapter that's a text file, you can create your own metadata for it. A really common use of that is what character POV is that chapter from. And if you have that, that's how I did in Realm Keepers. That's how I did the elemental symbols at the top of each chapter. Was it referenced what character is this chapter from? Okay, we're going to put that character symbol at the top of the chapter. Another one is location. Another one, if you had a story that was told from the viewpoint of multiple factions, like maybe you have a sort of very technological society and a more like warrior, brutish society. Like if you were writing a book about Vulcans versus Klingons,
Right.
one of them very logical and one of them very, "Rah, kill people with the faces." And you could tag each of your chapters with metadata as a Vulcan chapter or a Klingon chapter. And the font that began each chapter would change depending on that. It's like use the Vulcan font, which is very clean and simple lines. And then for this one, use the Klingon font, which is very bold and sharp and her.
Yeah.
It's hard to tell people like a specific usage for it because it's so powerful and versatile and everybody's book will be different. So like I feel like the best advice is Google how to use Scrivener metadata and just start futzing around with it. Just play around with different options for your book and you'll really swiftly discover, oh my God, this thing will change the way I format my books.
Yeah. Know what's possible. And then
Exactly.
Google it.
Yeah.
Cool. So do you use Scrivener for anything else? Blogging, journaling, free writing, anything like that?
I actually am in the middle of a what do you call it? A video series with the guys from Sterling and Stone. It's on hiatus right now, but I am working on bringing it back. It's called Nuts and Bolts, and it's how-tos on self-publishing. And there's some Scrivener data in there, but there's a lot more. Like there are very few tutorials online on how to actually publish your book to the Kindle store.
Right.
Like people know that you should publish to Kindle, but you could very easily get into the dashboard and be like, I don't know what to do. And the first couple of books that you publish, you don't do them right. You don't format your page correctly. You don't use the right tags. So that's what the series is called. So it's self-publishing Nuts and Bolts. It's on YouTube, and the series is going to be returning really soon. We write that series in Scrivener. We have a
cool.
shared Scrivener file, yeah, and every episode is its own script. that is a file in there. So I write the script, and then Sean goes through and edits it and makes sure that I'm not forgetting anything and that I'm not saying anything, I shouldn't be. And then I use that script. I export that script to a Kindle file, and that goes on my iPad, and that's what I use as like my little teleprompter when I'm filming the show.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, that's just one other way to use it. It's a damn versatile program.
Absolutely. Okay, cool. So now let's take a step back. We talked earlier about how these chats, these interviews are about going beyond Scrivener. I think we've definitely done that here. But one thing I like doing at the end is just kind of speculating, because we use all these writing tools. And I have, like you talked a little bit about how you want a couple new features in Scrivener, and it would be great if it could export to InDesign, for example. Right. But where do you see the future of creative writing tools headed? I mean, is Scrivener the end game? Obviously, they're going to improve it over time, but like, it's certainly not ideal because it doesn't do everything that we need right now.
Yeah, it's one of those things where like everything is the end game until you discover that there's a new game nobody even thought of before.
Right.
And I feel like Scrivener was actually very futurist, which is like a term that I really love. Is like a futurist is somebody who who knows what people need and want before they've even conceived of it. And before Scrivener, everybody was like, well, Word is word processing. That's what you use. And Scrivener was like, no, this is word processing. And everybody was like, oh my God. So what I see happening in the future is a couple of different things. First of all, a huge needed and wanted in the self-publishing industry is some capability for more graphics-oriented books, children's books, graphic novels. There is no way to design those and publish them to Kindle. When Kindle, and Kindle is working on it, they just released a new feature not too long ago that was like for Kindle kids books and graphic novels. Excuse me. Per reviews so far, it's a little bit short of the mark.
Yeah.
When that's really done and awesome and ready to go, you're going to see people developing tools for that. Maybe Scrivener will be into it, because like Scrivener is not good for graphic novels right now. It's not meant to be. It's a word processor. But you're going to see tools happening for that. I'm not sure if I buy the whole eBooks Plus thing. People talk about music playing while you read a book, and embedding videos in a book and additional features and everything. For me, I've tried some of those books.
Yeah.
I don't like the experience.
Yeah.
It's a novelty, but it doesn't really lend for me.
The only place I've seen it work is with iTunes U. Like you can download like a course, and you're basically watching like a series of lectures inside this one, ebook, essentially. But otherwise, like I wouldn't want any videos or music in my novels.
Yeah, completely. But like nobody thought that they wanted 3D until Avatar came out, and it was like, oh, that's how you do it right. Yeah. Let's do more of that. And so if eBooks Plus as a concept begins to take off more and starts to become more successful, and people do really amazing things with it, either Scrivener is going to adapt to that and make it a lot easier to do things like that, or some other new tool will come out that is. But as far as if you just want to write a more traditional book where the person sits down, begins to flip pages, and eventually comes to the end of the story, that's an art form that the creation process and the delivery process have changed slightly over time, but they haven't changed that much.
Right.
So except for some, minor adjustments, that, exporting to InDesign, being able to share files more easily. Except for things like that, it's hard for me to see something replacing Scrivener in the foreseeable future. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You mentioned briefly that you were working in a collaborative Scrivener file. That must be difficult.
It is. We do it through Dropbox. And Scrivener is really good about, like, if I go and try and open the file and Sean is working in it, it'll say, Sean's got this open, don't touch it.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
so
awesome.
that's really good. But sometimes I go to open it and it says Sean's got this open, don't touch it. And I text Sean, I'm like, hey dude, can you close the Scrivener file? And he's like, I don't have it open. So every once in a while you have something like that. But it Google Docs,
Yeah.
for example, you can both have the document open and you can both be writing in there. I'm not a programmer, so I don't know what goes into it, but it would be great if Scrivener could do that. If you could literally both be, if I could be writing the first draft like behind Sean while he's outlining, it's like he's laying down the railroad tracks and I'm just barreling down as a train. Holy cow, that would be fantastic.
It would. It would.
You could even have a third person following behind and editing as you go. The possibilities would be limitless.
Yeah.
So that's a key feature that I'd love to see. InDesign is a key feature that I'd love to see. And what was the third one? Well, those are the big ones.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, fantastic. Well, we're coming up on an hour, so we can wrap up now. Where's the best place that people can find you and your work online?
You can search me on Amazon, Garrett Robinson, or you can just go to my website. All of my books are there. It's garrettbrobinson.com. And if you sign up for my email list, which I, of course, recommend, you get a free copy of my book, Rebel Yell. I send you that ebook straight away so you can sort of check out what I want and check out what I do. And if you want a more fantasy work, Nightblade is my current series that people seem to be enjoying.
Cool. And when is that Nuts and Bolts series going to go back up on Sterling and Stone?
As soon as I can carve out the time to actually make the videos.
But you did a couple, right? You did like the first couple?
Yeah, there's 7 up there right now, and they cover
Several
things like how much does it cost to self-publish a book, what goes into the process, and a few things in Scrivener as well. So you can check it out. It's on YouTube, and just search self-publishing Nuts and Bolts.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Garrett.
Awesome.
All right, bye for now.